Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Sometimes people push you to your limits. In my case, it was my sister-in-law and brother-in-law who drove me there with their notorious cheapness. Let me set the scene. My husband and I have been members at this big warehouse store for years. It's one of those places where you pay an annual fee of $50 to shop there and get access to bulk items at good prices. We each had our own membership card, which was convenient when we needed to shop separately. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law are, to put it simply, extremely frugal. And not in a practical, responsible way. They're the type who will go to extraordinary lengths to save a dollar, even if it costs others. They're nice enough people otherwise, always pleasant at family gatherings, but their stinginess is something of a family joke. One day, my sister-in-law asked if she could borrow my husband's membership card for a quick shopping trip. My husband, being the generous guy he is, handed it over without a second thought. At first, I didn't mind. I'm generally happy to help family out, but something about this particular situation started to knot me. Maybe it was because I knew how cheap they were, or maybe it was the principle of borrowing something indefinitely without offering to return it. After about a month, I decided to ask for the card back. I politely told my sister-in-law that we needed my husband's membership card returned when she got a chance. She quickly agreed and promised to bring it over the next day. To her credit, she did return it promptly after I asked. When I asked him where his card was, he casually mentioned that he had lent it to his brother's wife. We were right back where we started. They had somehow managed to get their hands on a card again without saying a word to me. That's when I decided to try a different approach. The next time I was at their house, I casually brought up splitting the membership cost. I suggested that since we were all using the membership, we could split the annual fee of $50 per year, making it just $25 each. My sister-in-law quickly dismissed the idea, saying they really didn't use it that much, but she would talk to her husband about it. Her response told me everything I needed to know. They were happy to use our membership, but not willing to contribute even $25 towards it. That's when I hatched my plan. I logged into my account online and checked the recent activity. Sure enough, they were using our membership card 1 to 2 times every month. They were getting all the benefits without any of the costs. I didn't mention it to my husband or anyone else. I just waited. About a week later, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law went shopping at the warehouse store. They filled their cart with all sorts of items, probably feeling pretty smug about their savings. When they got to the checkout, they placed all their items on the belt and handed over the membership card. The cashier scanned it and then told them that the membership had expired. She apologetically explained that there was a renewal fee of $50 to continue. According to what I heard later, they were stunned. Rather than pay the fee themselves, they simply walked out of the store, leaving all their carefully selected items behind. My brother-in-law never mentioned this incident to me directly. Apparently, he had been annoyed by their cheapness too. My other brother-in-law recounted how my husband's brother and his wife had tried using our membership card and got caught because it was canceled. He laughed as he described how they had to walk away from a full cart of groceries. I pretended to be surprised, commenting that I had no idea they were still using our card. It's been several months now, and neither my sister-in-law nor my brother-in-law has ever brought up the incident. They never asked why the card was canceled or offered to pay for a new membership. Instead, they just stopped asking to borrow our cards. They still don't know it was me who canceled the membership. They probably think it was just bad timing. But I know, and that's enough for me. I've been a farmer all my life. Grew up watching my parents tend to our small plot of land, learning the ropes of animal husbandry and crop rotation before I could even properly tie my shoelaces. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I'd spent the last few years expanding bit by bit, added some chickens, planted more vegetables, and recently invested in a bull that I hoped would help grow my small herd of cattle. The bull was a massive creature with a notorious temperament. The previous owner had warned me repeatedly about his aggressive nature, especially towards strangers. I took all the necessary precautions, sturdy fencing, clear warning signs, and I always approached him with caution. Life on the farm was quiet and predictable until last Wednesday night. I had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day of fixing the chicken coop and tending to a sick goat. Around 2 a.m. I was jolted awake by the sound of my dogs barking frantically outside. This wasn't their usual, "there's a raccoon" bark. This was their full-blown alarm bark. I grabbed my flashlight and the baseball bat I keep by my bed and headed outside. The commotion seemed to be coming from the far pasture where I kept the bull and a few goats. When I approached, I heard human screaming mixed with the unmistakable angry snorting of my bull. That's when I saw her. A woman in her mid-40s, now covered in mud, sprawled on the ground trying to crawl toward the fence while my bull pawed the ground nearby, preparing for another charge. I yelled out, demanding to know what she was doing in my pasture. She begged for help and complained about my bull attacking her and ruining her expensive clothes. I carefully positioned myself where I could distract the bull if needed, but stayed outside the fence. I told her bluntly that she was trespassing on private property in the middle of the night, and questioned what she expected would happen. She explained that she was just trying to take one of my goats, because her friend had dared her as a joke. This woman had broken into my farm to steal one of my animals on a dare. I asked incredulously if she was insane to break onto my property to steal a goat. She defended herself by saying it was just a game of truth or dare from a party nearby and claimed she wasn't really going to take the goat. I told her that my bull didn't understand it was a game, and neither would the police, whom I was calling right away. She protested against me calling the police, trying to intimidate me by claiming her husband was friends with the sheriff. While keeping an eye on the bull, who had thankfully moved his attention to some hay, I called the police and explained the situation. The woman continued yelling threats and demands the entire time. She made excuses about not seeing them in the dark and questioned why anyone would keep dangerous animals where people could get hurt. I countered that people don't get hurt when they don't break into private property at 2 a.m. to steal livestock. It took about 20 minutes for the police to arrive. During that time, I managed to distract the bull enough that he moved to the far end of the pasture, giving me a chance to help the woman out through the gate. When the officers arrived, they immediately called an ambulance. While waiting, they took my statement and the woman's. Her story changed repeatedly. First, she was just taking a walk and got lost. Then she was dared, but wasn't really going to take the goat. Then she claimed someone told her this was public land. The officers weren't buying any of it. They found bolt cutters near where her boyfriend had fled, clearly showing intent to cut through my fence. The officer told her that she was being charged with criminal trespassing, attempted theft, and property damage, and that they would need her to come to the station after medical treatment. The woman became even more indignant, insisting she was the victim and that she could have died. The officer responded dryly that breaking into a farm with a bull was indeed a poor decision that could have ended worse than it did. As the paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, she was still yelling threats about lawsuits and calling her lawyer. The officer assured me that was the clear warning signs, her admission of trying to steal my goat, and the bolt cutters as evidence. Any lawsuit would be thrown out immediately. The next day, I installed security cameras around the property. I later heard that she'd been sentenced to community service and had to pay a fine. Apparently, her connections to the sheriff were greatly exaggerated, and my bull got an extra portion of feed that week. Best security system I never planned for. I finally have a story for this sub. So background. Tariffs change constantly, along with the definitions of what products count as what kind of products or materials being classified as specific exceptions. It's a complete mess. My days typically involve sorting through endless spreadsheets, checking classification codes, and making sure our company isn't accidentally breaking any import laws. Not the most exciting job, but it pays well, and I've always been good with details and regulations. About 6 months ago, my boss discovered something called duty drawback that could potentially save our company millions. To explain it simply, if our company imports products to the US but then immediately ships them to our franchise stores in Canada, we're technically just a stop on the route and not the final receiver. Our Canadian branches pay import taxes called duty on the products, but because we also paid taxes bringing them into the US first, our company can get a refund for the duty we initially paid. Hence, duty drawback. My boss was thrilled about this discovery. He immediately pitched it to the executives, who loved the idea of getting money back. However, they wanted results quickly, specifically within 2 months. They set an unreasonable deadline and expected us to meet it, and so began the nightmare. For months, I chased down information, digging through ancient records, discovering holes in our documentation, and trying to patch everything together. The math was complicated, and every time I thought I had figured it out, I'd find new errors that needed fixing. I was working up to 16-hour days, and my weekends disappeared in a flood of urgent work calls. My boss was right beside me the whole time, staying late, bringing me coffee, and helping where he could. We were a good team, and despite the pressure, we made steady progress. After 3 grueling months, we finally submitted the application. It was a day past the executive's arbitrary deadline, but we'd done it. A miracle of miracles, it worked. The company received a substantial tax return. You'd think everyone would be celebrating. But instead of praising our work, the higher-ups decided that my boss needed to be let go over poor performance and missed opportunities. They completely ignored the fact that this project was his idea in the first place and that their unreasonable deadline had been impossible from the start. I was furious but couldn't say anything without risking my own job. The next week, I got called into a meeting with several executives. One of them told me they needed complete records of everything covered by the duty drawback process. When I offered to send over all the digital files I had organized and backed up, they refused. The executive insisted that digital wasn't official enough. They demanded everything to be printed in binders with official letterhead and all sealed and signed. I pointed out that this would mean thousands of pages of documentation, but they didn't care. The executive just emphasized that they needed a paper trail for the auditors and that this was high priority. They instructed me to put everything else on hold until it was done. After they left, my boss's superior, who was temporarily covering his desk, came to me looking absolutely livid. When I confirmed they wanted everything printed and organized in binders, he got a vengeful look in his eye. He declared that if they wanted paperwork, then they would get exactly what they asked for. He instructed me to find the biggest binders possible and put everything else on hold until they got precisely what they wanted. Then he added with a mischievous grin that to ensure they saw absolutely everything, I should print it all single-sided. This was perfect malicious compliance. So that's what I've been doing for the past week. And that only gets us through June of year 1. Out of 5 years of documentation, the binder pile is already 3 feet tall, and I'm not even close to being done. I have to say, compared to the stress of the past few months, this mindless printing and organizing is practically a vacation. Yesterday, the executive who fired my boss walked by my desk and saw the growing tower of binders. They asked what all this was. I explained that I was just getting started on the paperwork they requested and that I was still only working on 2020. I mentioned that I would need at least 15 more binders to finish the project. The executive sputtered that 15 more binders was ridiculous. I reminded them that they had asked for everything to be printed, signed, and placed in binders, and that's exactly what I was providing. They walked away muttering about waste of resources and excessive documentation. I can't wait to see their face when we drop all of these binders on their desk next week. They'll have to find somewhere to store all this paperwork for the next 7 years for audit purposes. I heard the executive's office has some lovely built-in shelving that might be perfect. I've been working at this local auto shop for about 3 years now. It's a good gig, decent pay, I like my co-workers, and my boss is pretty cool. We're the only shop in our small town, which means we get all kinds of customers. Most are fine, but lately, We've had some drama because of the political climate. See, half our mechanics are Hispanic and speak Spanish to each other while they work. It's never been an issue before, but recently, some customers have been making comments about it. My boss doesn't tolerate that nonsense. Whenever someone complains about our mechanics speaking Spanish, he tells them straight up to mind their own business and reminds them that Pep Boys, the dealerships, and Walmart auto centers are all in the next town over if they have a problem with how we run things. Not many people want to pay that just because they're uncomfortable hearing Spanish. Last Saturday, this older guy comes in. I'll call him Boomer Dan. From the minute he walked in, you could tell he had an attitude problem. He drove a new Honda sedan but acted like it was some top-of-the-line off-road vehicle. The guy couldn't afford a truck but treated his Honda like it was a 4x4. As soon as he pulled up, we could hear something dragging underneath his car. When we got it up on the lift, we saw he'd somehow ripped off the plastic undercarriage shield and it had wrapped around one of the half shafts. It was making this awful grinding noise and starting to smell like burning plastic. Dan came stomping into the shop area where we were examining his car. He immediately demanded that we fix his car right away because he was heading to Los Angeles later that day. My boss explained what happened was a plastic shield. He told Dan that we could remove the damaged shield for him but warned that there might be other damage underneath that we couldn't see yet. He explained that we'd need to do a full inspection. Dan impatiently told my boss to just fix the noise, saying he didn't have time for this. While my boss was talking to Dan, a couple of our mechanics were chatting and laughing in Spanish nearby. They weren't even working on Dan's car, but he immediately zeroed in on them. He made a rude comment suggesting that if my boss hired proper mechanics who speak English, they'd get more work done instead of standing around gossiping. The shop went silent. My boss's face turned red, and I could tell he was holding back from saying what he really wanted to say. He asked Dan to repeat what he'd just said, his tone making it clear he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Dan doubled down, saying he'd been perfectly clear. He rudely stated that our mechanics were just standing around speaking what he incorrectly called Mexican instead of fixing his car. My boss corrected him, explaining that, first of all, they were speaking Spanish, not Mexican. Second, they were on their break. And third, they were the best mechanics in this town. Dan dismissed this explanation and just demanded again that we fix his car immediately. My boss took a deep breath and then delivered the bad news. He told Dan that he didn't think we could help him today. In fact, he told him that we were booked solid for the next week, maybe even 2. He suggested that Dan was welcome to try one of the shops in the next town over if he was in a hurry. He protested that my boss couldn't do that to him because he needed his car today. My boss suggested that Dan start calling for a tow truck. Dan just stood there with his mouth open. Then he started making threats about reporting us and leaving bad reviews. My boss remained calm, telling Dan to feel free to do so. Then he asked if Dan wanted to leave his car here for when we could get to it, or if he wanted to pay for that tow. Dan stormed out, cursing under his breath. He didn't even wait for us to get his car off the lift, just left it and walked home. We figured he'd cool down and come back later, but he didn't. We actually fixed his car that same night after closing. It was a simple job, just cutting away the damaged plastic and replacing it with a new shield. Total cost for the part was only $75 and it took about an hour. But because of his attitude and disrespect toward our mechanics, my boss decided to stick to what he told Dan. Dan protested loudly, exclaiming that it would be 2 weeks before he could get his car back and complained that he needed his car right away. My boss reminded him that he should have thought about that before insulting our staff. He then told Dan he'd see him in 2 weeks. It's been over a week now and Dan's car has been sitting in our lot, completely fixed and ready to go. Dan has been spotted around town getting rides from neighbors and family members, looking miserable every time. Some people just need to learn that a little respect goes a long way, especially when we're the only shop in town. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.